have a question first.
Sure, no problem.
Does the main sentence have to be at the beginning of that, what you call this, the unit of stanza?
The stanza?
Does it have to be at the beginning or not necessarily?
No, it doesn't have to be. Poetry is a little more difficult because of the repetition. But no, it doesn't have to be. What did you think about for this one? What did you come up with?
Yeah, because I do not know if it's the being separate of God, where we can see that in verse 3, holy is he, or is it the Lord reigns? But it's kind of both, like he is separate as a king, something like that, and therefore he must be praised. But
because there's really a series of statements here, isn't there? The Lord reigns, let the people tremble, he's enthroned, let the earth shake. These are all sort of independent statements, right? Independent
but but if I'm going also to really look at the how he develops his thought, I'm leaning toward choosing the Lord reigns, because somewhat it's a celebration of God as king, something like that. He's being separate.
Well, and that's why I have this second step where to also identify the linked words and phrases, because by the repetition, we can sort of see a focus here, right? I mean, what did you come up with? What were some linked words or phrases?
I think the author is focused on our response because of the repetition of the word let the people tremble, let the earth shake, let them praise your name. And then if you're going to like look at the next line, it's kind of explaining how the Lord reigns. He is enthroned above the heaven, he is exalted, he is great. And then the second half of his statement is always about response. He talks first about the reason or the motivation for the response, and that is the Lord as king. Yeah, something like that. And then the next part is the response.
Yeah. Okay, good. So this we see this theme of or idea of greatness or being exalted, right? By the repetition of these synonyms here, right? Is that what you're saying? Or are you saying something else?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, good. Anyone else have any want to give any input? Yeah.
My main sentence would be holy is he, and the links and the repetitions are the Lord reigns, that he is enthroned and he is exalted. Lord is great. Those are my repetitions.
Yeah.
Those are my links. So my main sentence really is holy is he, because of these repetitions. It kind of define how holy God is.
Yeah, it all supports that because he is great, exalted, high, above us. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's good. And I think as we put all this together, what Pastor Rex, what did you have as sort of your summary statement or sentence? What did you put?
So my summary sentence is that people should tremble, should worship God because He is holy. That would be my summary.
Okay. Okay, good. Anyone else have a different summary or want to add anything to this?
Yeah, I'll try Pastor Tim.
Okay.
The Lord who reigns is holy, demands obedience. He is holy and must be worshipped.
Okay, as your summary, he is holy and must be worshipped. Is that?
Yeah.
Okay.
The Lord who reigns is holy, demands obedience. He is holy and must be worshipped.
Okay.
Pastor Tev, I'll try.
Okay.
Okay. The Lord is the great King. Let everyone praise and worship him.
Great King, let everyone
Let-
praise and worship
the
him.
Lord is the great holy King.
Oh,
To
holy.
capture it.
Okay, good. Holy King.
It's not just a king, he is holy King.
Okay, good.
Let everyone praise and worship him.
Yeah, I think I put something like praise, holy, and I put Yahweh because that was for his greatness, something like that. But we can see basically, you know, these are all similar. We might word it a little bit differently, but I think we can see from the focus here of this stanza, right? It's the greatness, the highness, the exaltedness of God,
Mm.
his holiness, his separateness, and then the response needs to be this worship, this reverence, praise. All right, both of those elements. Now it's hard to pick out a main sentence because you know they're all sentences and they all seem important, right? So in this case,
Yes.
a main sentence is a little difficult to identify. Maybe I think either the Lord reigns or holy is he would be two good candidates.
The Lord is
The Lord is great. Yeah, it's the same idea, right? And that's what I was talking about before, that in poetry, you'll often have this repetition. Now in like epistles or, you know, that kind of a genre, usually it's a main sentence and then all the rest of the paragraph sort of modifies or supports that main sentence. But in poetry, there's often this focus and repetition going on that so the main sentence is a little harder to identify. Why don't we try, let's try to do verses 4 and 5. Let's do one more together, or I'll have you guys take a few minutes and do that. All right, so try verses 4 to 5 and see what you come up with as far as let's do the same thing. Okay, and I actually had put mine here, so I'm going to take that off. Okay, so I put it here for you. Again, just go through those 3 steps. See if you can identify a main sentence, but then especially look for any linked words, phrases. So go ahead and do that for these verses. I'll give you a few minutes. All right, just take another minute. Okay. Let's see, Pastor German, how about you? You want to? What did you get?
Okay,
Get for this?
for the main sentence, I love the word to take God. God is eternal in. Uh, God is wise to execute justice.
Okay. Let's take
For
it.
okay.
Yeah, the
For the
main
link word,
sentence.
okay. The main sentence is King loves justice.
Okay. And here we'll just use the full King loves justice. Okay, what did you have for some linked words, repeated words.
Okay, the repeated words is loves justice, established equity, and executed justice.
Okay, I'll just,
Similar words.
yeah. And we could even throw righteousness in there. It's
Yeah.
some similarity. Okay, good. Any others that you saw?
So maybe that's all, Pastor Tim, because verse 5 is the response.
Okay, is there
How-
anything repeated there in verse 5?
Exalt, worship.
Yeah.
So
Okay, good. Yeah, that's essentially what I got. So, Pastor German, what was your summary sentence again then?
okay, the summary. Okay,
Yeah.
The summary is because God loves justice, people worship Him.
Okay. All right. Good. That's good. Anyone else have any additional comment or thoughts? You want to?
The Pastor Tim, I think the focus of verses 1 to 3 is more on a description of the enthronement of God as king, while verse 4 and 5 this time describes the action of this king, and that is his, because the word established, executed are somewhat
Yes.
related as well. It focuses on his action this time.
Yeah, and so that's why I had in the verses 1 to 3, I think I said praise God for his praise holy Yahweh for his greatness. But here, yeah, there's an action, isn't there? It's more of that greatness is displayed by his actions. In this case, what is his action? Is there a particular
He
action?
established justice.
Justice.
Yeah, justice.
Execution.
Yeah.
Praise
Just-
holy Yahweh for his justice.
Yeah, in fact,
Righteous judgment.
yeah, righteous judgment. Yeah, that word justice is repeated, so that's why I put that there. So, Kenneth, what did you have for your summary sentence?
Exalt the holy and just king.
Okay, so Kenneth had. Yeah. Exalt the holy and just king.
Yes, Pastor Tim.
Okay. All right, good. Anyone else have anything they want to add? I think I had praise holy Yahweh for his justice. That's what I put for this one. Okay, good. Again, what's driving this, we do see sort of in the first sentence this idea, but again, notice we have multiple sentences which are all saying something similar. So if identifying the main sentence is a little challenging, but again, we're guided by what's repeated here. We're guided by what's linked together, and that's a common trait in poetry. We'll often be able to find the main point by seeing what is repeated by the poet. That's certainly the case here in this particular psalm. Now, the last stanza, again, I had trouble coming up with a main sentence, but when I looked at the linked words, called, answered, exalt, worship, testimony, I also noticed forgiving is a key word here. So I had put praise holy Yahweh for his mercy. Because again, the holiness of God as seen in his mercy, that these men called upon him and he answered them, and he was forgiving, an avenger, but also forgiving. And then the same response, exalt and worship. Okay. So that's really forms there's 3 units of thought in this particular psalm. And so if we were to summarize those, let's see, did I do that here? Yeah. So here, this just shows, I just put it more in a visual form, his unit of thought. Stanza 1, praise holy Yahweh for his greatness. And these are my summary statements. I know some of you had slightly different ones, and then the second stanza. The first stanza is, as Kenneth pointed out, I think a good insight. The focus here was on God's position, his exaltedness. The second stanza turned attention towards his action. In this case, his justice. Worship holy Yahweh for his justice. And then the third stanza again focused on his action, and that was, I summarized it as mercy. There could be, you might say grace or something like that, but all 3 of these are a call to respond to holy Yahweh, and that holiness is seen in the first stanza in his greatness, the second stanza in his justice, and the third stanza in his mercy. All right? So this is essentially the contextual flow of Psalm 99. All right. Now, we need to understand there's an important distinction when it comes to poetry, particularly Hebrew poetry. We have really 2 different kinds of, I guess what I say, books, or we need to recognize there are 2 kinds of poems involved in Hebrew poetry when we want to understand contextual flow. And what I mean by that is this. There are independent poems, okay? And Psalm 99 is an example of that. So we take the independent poem, which has its own setting, its own background, and we summarize each stanza of that poem. And it's all self-contained, all right? Psalm 99 is an independent statement, an independent poem that is not linked to any other part of the book of Psalms. Now, some of its themes are similar to other Psalms in the book of Psalms, but it's not connected together to Psalm 98, to Psalm 100 and 101. There's not an intentional connection by the same author. In fact, those Psalms are written by different authors, most likely. And so we have that kind of poem, which really is the psalm. It's the independent poem that has its own occasion, its own purpose, its own background context. But then there are many poems which are written and they are embedded in a book. For example, Jonah chapter 2 is one example, right? You have a narrative there. Jonah chapter 1 is the sailors, and then Jonah 2 is a psalm. It's a poem expressed by Jonah while he was inside the fish. Chapter 3 goes back to a narrative, and chapter 4 is also a part of the narrative. So that's one example. Another example is Exodus 15. I think it's the song of, if I remember right, is it the song of Miriam or Moses? Oh, Moses.
Song of Moses.
Moses. And Moses, right, he sang this song, and it's really a poem, but it's in the middle of this narrative. Deuteronomy 32, that's another poem that Moses taught to the people of Israel. And it really has the features of a psalm, and it's written, embedded in the book of Deuteronomy, a narrative. Hannah's poem in 1 Samuel chapter 2. It's part of a narrative. David gives a psalm at the end of his 2 Samuel, the book of Samuel, 2 Samuel. And so these are all examples. Habakkuk could be another one. Habakkuk chapter 3 is an example where we have a psalm that's in that prophetic book. And so here, these particular psalms or poems are part of a bigger book. They're not independent. They're not isolated. They're actually part of the flow of thought of that book overall. Psalm 99 isn't, right? You have Psalm 96, then Psalm 97, Psalm 98, Psalm 99, Psalm 100, right? I could keep going, right? These are all independent. You can interpret them by themselves. You don't have to interpret Psalm 96 in order to interpret Psalm 97. You understand my point? They're
Yes.
independent. Now, again, there are some similar themes, but they're not linked together. However, to interpret Jonah chapter 2, you have to understand Jonah chapter 1 and Jonah chapter 3. They're all part of one book. All right?
Okay.
The same with Exodus 15. We don't study Exodus 15 by itself. We also have to understand what brought that poem about. What circumstance caused that poem? Well, that circumstance is found in what was written before. Okay. The same with these others. Habakkuk chapter 3. There's a poem. The last chapter in Habakkuk is this psalm, but it's a psalm in response to chapters 1 and 2. Okay. So contextual flow, what I'm trying to get at here is, here's the example from Jonah. Okay. Jonah chapter 1. I summarized that chapter as God shows mercy on the sailors by saving them from the storm and from judgment, right? Because at the end of the story, they end up fearing Yahweh. And then you have Jonah 2, and this is the psalm. This is the poem. Jonah, in this poem, it's a poem of thanksgiving. It's a thanksgiving psalm, really. And Jonah declares his thankfulness to God, gratitude to God for saving him from drowning. And then we have Jonah chapter 3, which goes back to narrative. God shows his mercy on the Ninevites by relenting of his judgment. And then Jonah 4, God teaches Jonah a lesson on compassion. So this overall is the contextual flow of Jonah. Okay? This is a summary of each story within Jonah. Jonah chapter 2 is a poem within that story. Okay, so we can't separate Jonah 2 from the rest of the book of Jonah. It's part of the book. So to understand the poem in Jonah 2, we have to understand it's part of the contextual flow of the whole book. Okay? And it's really an irony that it's there because God shows mercy on the sailors. He shows mercy on Jonah, and Jonah's grateful to God for that mercy by saving him from drowning. And yet the whole story is how Jonah doesn't want God to show mercy to these pagan Gentiles. And yet he shows mercy to the sailors. Then he shows mercy to the Ninevites. And he shows mercy to Jonah. And Jonah's happy about the mercy that he gets, but he's not happy about the mercy that the Ninevites and the sailors get, especially the Ninevites. He seems indifferent to the sailors. And so Jonah 2, really, it's an irony that there's this great psalm of thanksgiving right in the middle of this book, and yet the guy speaking the psalm is a hypocrite. Okay, so when you interpret Jonah 2, you're going to do the same thing that we did for Psalm 99. You'll identify the stanzas, summarize each stanza, but remember, they're not isolated. They're part of the whole book. Okay, it's one piece of the book of Jonah.
Pastor Tim, how about the book of Job?
Job.
Yeah,
Yeah, Job
It is
is. Yeah, go ahead.
it is a single or embedded ideas that the book becomes a one whole book. The flow of idea is continuous.
Yeah, Job is interesting. Job is a narrative. It's also wisdom literature, but it also contains poetry. So you have all those elements, right? Because Job is a narrative. It starts out in Job 1 and 2 is narrative, right? It tells the story of what happened to Job and Satan coming and all that, right? And then in
Right.
Job 3, through, what is it, 33 is a dialogue between Job and his three friends, right? What are their names? Zophar, Bildad, and what's the third guy? I forget.
Rex.
Rex?
This
Oh.
other one, the young
Rex.
Therefore, Pastor Tim.
Something like Elihu or Abihu, something like that.
Well, no, Elihu.
Elihu the younger.
Elihu comes in chapter 33, I think, or 34. The 37. I might have these off. This is Elihu. And then Job 38 to 41 is God. All right, so basically, it's mostly narrative. The whole book is, and mostly dialogue. So that's a feature of narrative, but it's dialogue that's in a poetic, expressed in a poetic way. So there's elements of poetry. So they're not like a psalm necessarily. It's really more like a dialogue with, and so you're going to be looking at it as paragraphs within the dialogue, because there'll be a few points being made with, as Job speaks, he's making up one point, or he'll have maybe one or two paragraphs, and then Zophar will have his one or two or three paragraphs, and then Bildad speak, or it usually was Job, then one of his friends, then Job, then another friend, then Job, then another friend, right? And they go back and forth. And so how you would summarize that is, you would take, so if we look at Job, let's just do that. Okay. So here's Job. And of course, chapter 1, that's just narrative, but a lot of it's dialogue between the Lord and Satan. Still narrative features though, right? Narrative, telling the story. Chapter 2, same thing, narrative. All right, then we get to chapter 3, and Job now speaks a lament. And notice it's in a poetic manner. So he's using the genre of poetry. So we need to identify imagery. We need to identify figurative language, but it's in the form of a narrative. So he just declares this, and notice the poetic nature. Let the day perish. Let not God above care. Let darkness and black gloom claim. You see the repetition, right? He's lamenting. Okay. Why didn't I? So notice there's a verses 1 to 10 form one paragraph or one idea that Job presents. Then verses 11 through 19, another paragraph. I wish I was never born. Being born is a curse. Right? The first paragraph is just Job saying, life is awful. And he expresses that in a very poetic way. The second paragraph, he said, I wish I was never born. Then the third paragraph, he laments about, everyone dies in the end. Okay, so we can see here specific units of thought, right? And they're expressed in a poetic way. So Job's response in chapter 3 is 3 statements. Life is horrible. I wish I was never born. Everyone dies anyway. Okay, that's a very simplistic summary, but you get the idea, right? And then chapter 4, Eliphaz, that was the other guy. Eliphaz. He speaks up. And Eliphaz has his points. Verses 1 to 6. You've been blessed, and now something bad happens, and
you are sinning.
Yeah, verses 7 to 11. Okay, and you can see there are paragraphs here. Now, it's not like a psalm in one sense. but it is poetic, but he's presenting particular units of thought. All right. And then he keeps going in chapter 5. He has several more thoughts. And then Job responds. So it's this back and forth, right? Job responds. And so what you would do if you were studying Job is you would essentially do this. Okay. So I would have something like, all right, Job 1 and 2, you're going to describe it as a narrative, right? So you're going to study the scenes. Okay. And then really the rest of, or Job 3 all the way to what? 30. Let me get the chapters right here. 31 is still narrative, but it's in the form of dialogue, and the genre is poetic. So you're going to have like Job 3 verses 1 to 7. So Job 3 is Job speaking, his response, and then he says something in verses 1 to 7, and then I don't remember the exact, 8 to 15, 16 to 25, something like that, right? Remember his point was my life is horrible. I wish I was never born. Everyone dies in the end. I mean, that was kind of his. And then you had in Job 4 to 5, you have Eliphaz speaking. And he made several points, verses 1 to 10 and 11 to, I don't know what, etc. Right? And then in Job 6, Job responds. Okay, and then you'll break it up by paragraphs. Okay, but you'll use the same approach that we talked about here to summarize each paragraph. See if you can find a main sentence, and then look for what's repeated. Look for what's linked together. And it'll go like this. It'll be a dialogue all the way to Job 32, where Elihu speaks. And he has a particularly long, basically like a sermon, that he continues all the way, I think, through chapter 37. Yeah. And then Job 38 to 41, God speaks. And then Job 42 is the conclusion, the story. So the whole book of Job, you would interpret like a narrative, all right? Because there's features of the narrative, then there's a dialogue all the way through. That's narrative, right? And then you have the conclusion. Within the dialogue, you're going to also need to identify the poetic elements that we see there because they're expressed in a poetic way in the dialogue. And then, which is common in wisdom literature. And so also in that, then you're going to note it is separated. The dialogue is broken up into paragraphs. All right. As I mentioned in Job 3, what he says, he does use poetry, but he breaks it up into his units of thought, and I would call those paragraphs. Okay. Pastor German, does that answer what you were asking, or was there something else? Again, I like. What's that?
It makes sense and so useful. Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm trying to help you guys see is that, we've looked at elements of epistles. Epistles are didactic. They're broken into paragraphs, and they're instructional. Narrative is more focused on scenes. But in this particular narrative, you have people making points. It's instructive. All right. Now, their instruction may not be correct or accurate, but that's the nature of what they're going back and forth about why God did this. You know, Job's saying, I just want to die. What did I do wrong? And each of these other guys are saying, you know, you've sinned in some way. God is just. You've done something wrong. Admit it, Job. And Job would come back and say, what did I do? God, give me an audience so I can explain my case. So it goes back and forth like that. But as you interpret it, you're going to interpret it with kind of like an epistle, in that you'll break down each paragraph and identify the main sentence, identify what's repeated, and then summarize it. But you're going to notice that there's poetic features. So that it makes this a little more complicated, because it's these different genres that are mixing together. But this is why it's important to understand, when you have a book of Psalms, you have these independent poems that have certain features. Then you have books where there are psalms embedded within a book. And then you have, thirdly, these kind of books like Job, which are written with poetic language, but they're not like Psalms. They're like an extended poetic communication. But in the case of Job, it's didactic in nature. It's instructional, part of it. And part of it is lamenting and, just pouring out his heart. Okay, so you have to be aware of what kind of writing you're dealing with here. Habakkuk is the same way. We're going to see that in the next module on prophecy. Habakkuk is a dialogue. The first 2 chapters. Habakkuk and God in a dialogue. And then the 3rd chapter is Habakkuk's response, and he chooses to respond in the form of a psalm. But the whole book is written using poetic language. There's figurative language, there's imagery, even though it's a dialogue, just like in Job. Job's a dialogue, but it's a certain type of dialogue that's poetic in nature. All right. So, short question always gets a long answer from me. So, but I hope.
Thank you, Pastor Tim. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
Same with
I'm sorry.
Luke, the book of Luke, with Zechariah and Mary's.
Yeah. Luke. If you think about Luke,
Mary's Magnificat.
Yeah, you have Luke, and then in the first chapter, you have narrative. Let me just... In Luke chapter 1, it's narrative up until, right, Elizabeth. Let me see. Or the Magnificat. So verses 1 through 45 is narrative. And then Luke 1:46 to 55 is Mary's Magnificat, and it's really it's really written in the form of a psalm. Okay, so you're going to study that like you would a psalm, but we remember it's embedded within a bigger book, right? And it's the same thing that happens. Okay, Luke 1:56 through 66 is narrative, and then guess what? In Luke 1:67 and on is Zechariah's and poem that he gives, where it's really prophetic in a lot of ways too. And that's 170 through 79. So you have, in this narrative, you have a couple of poems inside of it. So you'll study those poems using things you've learned for poetry, but recognizing it's part of a narrative. So to understand the context for that poem, we have to understand the narrative around it. It's just like parables, right? Parables are the same kind of thing. They're a certain kind of genre embedded within a larger book. So you'll have Luke's narrative, and then all of a sudden there'll be a parable. A parable is an isolated, or not isolated, it's a independent story to make a particular point, but that point is related to the context. There's something that happened or something that was said that prompted Jesus to give the parable. Just like here, something happened that prompted Mary to speak this, her Magnificat. All right. And so the author in these books there's a flow of thought for the book as a whole, and he has chosen to put a poem that someone speaks within his flow of thought. Just like in Jonah, the author puts Jonah chapter 2 in the middle of that. And Habakkuk ends with a psalm at the end of that book. And as we saw in Job, we have overall, it's like a narrative. It is a narrative. It's mainly dialogue, but the dialogue is poetic in nature. Okay. All right. Any other comments or questions? So what I'm wanting you to understand then is the Proverbs is an interesting book. The Proverbs is a book. It's kind of a mixture. Let me see if I can show you here. So for Proverbs, I'm having you identify the background context and the contextual flow because Proverbs is a book. It has a book with a particular purpose, mostly one author. And here's the structure of it. All right. The first 9 chapters are these extended poems. All right. Chapter long poems. So chapter 1 is a poem with a particular theme. Chapter 2 is another extended poem with a particular theme. Chapter 3, all the way through chapter 9. So each chapter is a poem with a distinct theme, but they're linked together. There's a flow of thought from chapter 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. So chapters 1 through 9 form one section of the book of Proverbs with these 9 poems that all are interconnected. They're related to one another. Now, when you get to chapter 10, from chapter 10 all the way through chapter 24 are these short, actually beyond 24, all the way to 30, are these short aphorisms, right? These 1 or 2 verse long statements that are what we think of the book of Proverbs. And then those chapters don't have an overarching theme that or a flow of thought. They're sort of these independent proverbs there. So chapters 1 through 9 have a flow of thought. Chapters 10 to 29 are just these general proverbs that cover a wide range of topics. And then chapter 30 and 31 come back to focusing on a few particular themes, just as in the beginning. So it's an interesting book. And if you go to the teacher's manual of the module 3, you can, near the back, there's several pages that go into the book of Proverbs. You'll find a lot of helpful information for this first assignment that's due this week in Proverbs, the background and the literary context. Now, let me show you the format that I'd like you to do for this. Now, if you have already done your assignment 1 for Proverbs, that's okay. If you followed the format that I gave you in the notes, but I modified things a little bit. So I want you to just take note of that. If you haven't completed this assignment yet, I'd like you to follow this format. All right. So here we go. Let me show it to you. For the background context, that's what we talked about last week. You're just going to fill in information for each of these elements. And again, look at the teacher's manual for module 3. You'll get a lot of answers actually from there. That'll be a good starting point. All right. But read through, and what I told you to do is just read through Proverbs 1 through 9 several times. You don't have to read through the whole book several times. I think at least once, but focus attention on chapters 1 to 9, because that's where this sort of mini book within the book is contained. All right. And then fill in the information here for the background context. And I'll give you a hint. Proverbs 1 through 7 will be very helpful for several of these categories. All right. Now, for the literary context, here's what I'd like you to do. Instead of going through the whole book, I want you to focus on chapters 1 through 9 and just summarize the main idea of each chapter. So I did chapter 1 just as an example. Okay. And what I want you to do is just summarize the point or the theme of each of those chapters, just 1 through 9. Okay. And then what I'd like you to do is for your passage, I want you to go through the steps we just talked about. Break up your chapter with your passage in it into the stanzas or into the paragraphs and summarize each of those paragraphs. Just like we did today, for example. All right. So summarize each stanza or paragraph. Maybe I can put that, or paragraph in the chapter where your passage is found. So let's say your passage is Proverbs 2, 1 through 8. So then you're going to do this step for Proverbs chapter 2. You don't have to do it for all 9 chapters. For all 9 chapters, I just want you to summarize the theme of each chapter. In step 3, I want you to then go to your chapter and break it down into its paragraphs and summarize each paragraph. Now I'm doing this because I only gave each of you just a small few verses from those chapters. I didn't give you the whole chapter. Okay, I was being nice to you. All right, I just gave you a part of it, but I want you to understand the whole chapter so that you understand how your passage fits within that chapter, and then I want you to understand how your chapter fits within Proverbs 1 through 9. Okay, that's what I'm after here.
Okay.
All right. So, and again, you have this document. I sent it on Facebook Messenger, so you can look there to get the detail, to look at this document. So I just show you an example from Proverbs 1. I said, now let's say if your passage was Proverbs 1, 10 to 15, you would summarize each stanza just from chapter 1. All right. And that's what I do here for an example. And then the step 4 is to summarize how your passage fits within the flow of thought in those first 9 chapters. Okay. Now in the appendix, I put the background context, all those questions that are just a guide. You don't have to answer every question, but they're just meant to guide you in the process. So basically for this assignment, you're doing 2 things, the background context and the contextual flow. The background context is just each of these categories, identify information. And again, focus on Proverbs 1 verses 1 to 7 will give you a lot for that. And then the literary context or contextual flow, that is where summarize each chapter, chapters 1 to 9, and then summarize each paragraph in the chapter of your passage. That's step 3. And then step 4 is just how does your passage fit within those first 9 chapters as far as the theme and the idea. Okay. All right. Any questions?
None, Pastor Tim.
None? You're okay? All right.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, like I said, a lot of this, at least the background context, you can be helped by looking at the notes, the teacher's manual, and also looking at the first 7 verses of Proverbs. The literary context, you're just going to have to read through these chapters several times and just summarize the theme overall for the whole chapter. All right. You don't have to break down the paragraphs of every chapter. Just do that for your chapter. But at least summarize the theme of each chapter. And then the third step, you'll break down the paragraphs in your chapter. All right.
Right.
Okay. And next week, then, we're going to turn our attention to the second assignment, which will be, if I remember correctly, that's the I already forgot.
Setting and culture.
Let me see.
Structure, setting and structure.
Yeah, that sounds
Yes.
right. The setting and structure for your passage. And you'll already have the structure by doing this step here. You'll already have a good idea of the structure of your particular passage, at least the whole chapter. And then what I want you to do is break down your passage. Now, again, for some of you, just like in the Psalms, your passage is really one stanza. Okay? And so just like those of you who had Psalm 119, some of you are going to encounter that issue with your Proverbs passage where it's really one stanza, but you can sometimes break it down into a few subpoints. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So yeah, the next assignment 2, you're going to be looking at setting and structure, and we'll talk about that next week. And then next week, if you have any questions about your particular passage, when it comes to setting and structure, you can ask about that. Okay. And I did talk with Pastor AJ, Pastor TJ, and they said they would love to help with the preaching labs for the Proverbs passage. So that'll be in the second half of March, toward the end of March. So we'll talk more about that as we get closer, but so we'll be able to do something similar to as we did with the Psalm passage. Okay. Now there's still a couple of you guys, a couple guys that haven't submitted their recordings yet. So just make sure you get those done soon because we're diving into Proverbs now. Okay. All right. Well, if there's no further questions, then I'm going to ask Pastor Ramil if he could close us in prayer.
Okay, sige, let's come before the Lord.